16. Well, good morning, folks. It's 10 o'clock and time to start. So, get a Bible. Let's open it up to Mark chapter 10. One of the things that I learned in reading through this chapter was all the things that's not in this chapter. Because Mark chapter 10 covers what Luke covers in, I gotta find it here now. Nine, 10 through 18. Well, I would, actually 17. 10 through 17. 8 chapters of Luke is Mark chapter 10. And they have a world of stuff that's not in this chapter, which shows, I've said to you that sometimes the text doesn't show us when time is passing, or when it says something and we know time is passing, we have no idea if it's a small amount of time or a large amount of time. For example, the sending out of the 72 is not in Mark at all. It happens during this time period here. Luke 10 through 17 is not in the other two Gospels either. And that's not a great big thing, but it shows how time is passing. So I mentioned to you a while back that, Jesus was with his apostles for about 3 years. At this point, at the beginning of Mark 10, it's like 2 years have gone by. But when we get to Mark 11, we're getting close to Jesus going down to Jerusalem for the time that he's going to be killed. There's a year goes by there that isn't discussed in Mark chapter 10. That's not a big deal. It's just something that you pick up on when you compare the Gospels. Okay. Let me read to you Mark chapter 10, verses 1 through 9. Okay? We'll get started on this. All right? I'm reading out of the Pew Bible, the New International Version. Jesus then left that place and went into the region of Judea and across the Jordan. Again, crowds of people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. Some Pharisees came and tested him by asking, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" Now, you do know in that verse when it says test, what does that mean? Trick, yeah. Very good. I hadn't thought of that word. Yeah, they're not asking an honest question here. They're trying to trick him. In politics today, we call that a gotcha question. Either way you answer, you've been gotten. And so people don't like that kind of question. Anyway, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife? "What did Moses command you?" he replied. They said, "Moses permitted a man to write a certificate of divorce and send her away." Now that's out of Deuteronomy 24, which we're going to read here in a little bit. Jesus goes on. "It was because your hearts were hard that Jesus wrote you this law," Jesus replied. "But at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh." Verse 9, "Therefore what God has joined together, let no one separate." Let's go into the details of what he says here. Send her away, back in verse 4. As I said, that's Deuteronomy 24, verse 1. You don't have to turn over there, but I'm going to read Deuteronomy 24 and not stop at the end of verse 1. Oh, you are going to be in here. You got enticed, didn't you? Here's Deuteronomy 24, starting at verse 1. If a man marries a woman who becomes displeasing to him because he finds something indecent about her, and he writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her, and sends her from his house, and if after she leaves his house she becomes the wife of another man, and her second husband dislikes her and writes her a certificate of divorce, gives it to her and sends her from his house, or if he dies, then her first husband who divorced her is not allowed to marry her again after she has been defiled. That would be detestable in the eyes of the Lord. Do not bring sin upon the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. I had never read those verses until I was studying for this lesson here today. I knew about verse number 1 of giving her a certificate of divorce, but I never read this. And it's significant to me that in this discussion here, he says that there was a marriage, there was a divorce, she remarries, and either that guy sends her away with a certificate of divorce, or he just dies, but then she can't go back to husband number 1. That it's wrong, it's detestable. Or as the King James said, an abomination. That's the word it uses, okay? After she has been defiled. And so I thought, now, what does this mean, after she has been defiled? Defiled is not a compliment, is it? That means real bad, okay? And I got to thinking, what does that mean? Well, I think it is talking about her first husband who found something indecent about her. Now, that word indecent, what does that mean? Well, it's not decent. You know, the opposite of decent. Decent is good, indecent is bad. What does that mean? The text here doesn't discuss that. And because of that, over the centuries after Deuteronomy, there were two views that arose among the Jews. And you remember the names of the rabbis. What were their names? Okay. And they were very important rabbis in the Jewish history before the time of Christ. And they had a very different idea about what this word indecent meant and what caused the woman to be defiled. One of them, I don't know which one was the conservative or the hard-nosed, however you want to say that, he said it meant she had done something really, really bad. It doesn't mean adultery, not that she had committed adultery, but she had done something terrible bad that he couldn't live with her anymore, and so he would give her a certificate of divorce. The other fellow, who is it, Hillel? Yeah. More or less said that it could be any reason if he didn't like the way she burnt the toast. He didn't say burnt the toast because that, but that kind of thing. And so before the time of Jesus, you had two very different ideas of for what reason a Jew could divorce his wife. And it's talking about divorce, yeah.
Just to give like a reference to what he said even if he found a woman prettier than she.
Oh, brother.
Yeah, well, that's really what it said.
So the Jews themselves were divided on what these words here meant, okay? Now, Jesus gives his own commentary on this when he says, back in Mark, that he says, it was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote to you this law. That law about giving a certificate of divorce and sending her away. Someone want to take a crack at what Jesus meant when he said your hearts were hard? Tom?
Trying to satisfy your whims
Well, the liberal fellow, would be the whims of the moment. But even the other fellow who's saying it's got to be something serious, he feels he's found something that is bad enough that he doesn't want her around anymore. Yeah. You want to take a shot on that?
Sure. I would say that it speaks to, you wrote this because of your hardness of heart. Well, I think it speaks to both parties, both the one that was hurt and the one who did the hurting. So, one, human beings, we don't like to forgive, number one. And then, when you've done something wrong, we don't like to admit that we've done wrong. We don't want to reconcile kind of thing. So,
Yeah.
both hardness of heart on both sides.
Now, is Jesus complimenting them when he says your hearts were hard? I don't think so. He's saying that they were resistant to what God really wanted. And then he goes on to say what God really wanted, which is where he says, at the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. If you look after this in the Pew Bible, it says that's in Genesis chapter 1, verse 27. At the very beginning, shortly after creation. And then he goes on, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. Well, that's a quote too. Where's that from? If you look at the little letter after that in the Pew Bible, it says that's Genesis chapter 2. This is the very, very beginning. And he says this is from the beginning of, at the beginning of the creation, God made them male and female and so on. That's what God wanted, was what he said there in Genesis chapters 1 and chapters 2. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh, so that they're no longer two, but one flesh. Now, verse 9 is Jesus' comment or conclusion to this. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. So Jesus says, you guys were stubborn back then, and God allowed Moses to give the certificate of divorce, but that's not God's intent. And so in the church, and I think correctly, we've been taught that marriage should be for life. Marriage should be for one man, one woman for life. And I believe that all of my life. And I still believe it, But in the real world, sometimes it doesn't work out that way, does it? And so that's why it comes up about the thing about divorce. Okay, any comments on any of that we've read down through verse 9? There is one more verse that I think in the New Testament that very clearly talks to this same kind of thing. It's Hebrews chapter 13, verse 4. It's almost the very end of Hebrews. It's in a collection of a whole lot of other things. But he talks about how marriage should be thought of. Hebrews 13:4. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. Now, this is from the NIV. Sexually immoral in the King James was fornicator. So there are two different words there, fornicate and adultery. Marriage should be honored by all, and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. And I think that's a great verse for what God wants us to think of marriage as. First of all, marriage being honored by all. A lot of you are younger than I am. Some of you are maybe older than I am. But I remember the 60s very clearly. And starting in the 60s, there were people that stopped honoring marriage. They made fun of marriage. They disparaged marriage. They said there was no reason for people to be married. And we're suffering the consequences of that, I think, the 60s to now is 60 years? The generation above my generation and my family, I only had 12 or 13 aunts and uncles, and I had 37 first cousins. I had a pile of family, okay? A lot of them have gone on. All my aunts and uncles are passed on now, and a lot of my cousins have been. But in that generation, there was never one divorce. In my generation, almost all of my cousins have been divorced. It shows how there's been a real change, is what I'm trying to get, in our culture in the last 60 years.
I just want to say amen to what you're saying when you said where it's becoming commonplace, and I think that's where a lot of our problems have started is when people aren't committed in their marriages.
Sure.
It takes the husband or the mom out of the household, and that's where it all started. And the people look at kind of weird when you say that because it's commonplace for this to be happening in this day and age. We shouldn't let them be commonplace. We've got one who kind of have. I don't know what we have as a church, but as a society, we have done it. And it's funny that you're talking about this today, Gary, because I had taught a class in Matthew last week about the same subject.
Yeah.
So I just want to tell you, I agree, absolutely agree with you.
Any other comments? Okay, let's move on. We'll go down to verse 13 and about Jesus bringing a little. Oh, no, we can't do that, can we? Because there's 2 other verses in here. Kind of wish we could. Because as I was studying this an awful lot the last few days, I thought, really? In 2 verses, verses 11 and 12, and we're going to spend the next 6 weeks. And I thought, man, I got a goal to try to finish that today. And I still would like to have that goal, but I'm not sure if it's going to happen that way. We will do what we can do in the time that we have. But let's keep first what God wants it to be like, for marriage to be honored. And that's not the way marriage is today. In fact, something we don't like to talk about in church is how many people just live together. They think marriage is not important to them, and they just don't see any reason to get married. There's a large percentage of our young people, not our young people across the world for all that matter, but in the United States especially, that they don't think of getting married at all. They just live together until they don't want to live together. And if they marry, it often is not for the way that God thinks of marriage. I told you I had a first cousin, one of my 30-odd first cousins that I had never met, and I met him at a family get-together down in Arkansas, and I had heard that he was engaged, and I went over and congratulated him and said, way to get us started. Conversation started with him, and the first words out of his mouth was, we'll try it, and if it doesn't work, we'll get divorced. And I didn't want to argue with him, and I didn't. But I thought to myself, what are the odds of this marriage having a chance? And I thought the odds were very, very low. He had no idea of staying married to her the rest of his life, and said it in those words. And then I found out later that they were married about 2 years and they divorced. Okay. Not have any other comments, we're going to go to verses 10, 11, and 12 and have a lot of fun. When they were in the house again, the disciples asked Jesus about this. He answered, anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. Let's look at these words for just a minute. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. That phrase, against her, is not found in the other times, and we're going to read those other times here in just a second. What does that mean? Commits adultery against her. Well, you got 2 women involved here, his first wife and second wife. Is the first wife or the second wife? I would think probably he's the first wife. He divorces his wife, marries another, commits adultery against the first wife. What does that mean? Commit adultery against her. Everybody shy? That's okay. That's okay. Obviously, it's not, it's not a compliment. He's saying he's done something bad with her or against her. He has done something that hasn't been helpful, although he's already divorced from her. Okay. Yes. Sexual sin. And in the Greek word, commit adultery is one word, one verb. Okay, it's not two words. And that's not a big deal. But it doesn't, and commit, by the way, in that word does not imply ongoing. Commit, I could read to you where it is. It's present tense, and it's called the aorist tense, which means it happens one time. It's happened at the time of the divorce, and in this case, the remarriage. Commits adultery, but it's not an ongoing thing here. In the grammar, it's not an ongoing thing. Were you done with what you were saying? Sure. Adultery is sexual sin. Well, it says the word adultery, but the word adultery means sexual sin, but it can sometimes mean something other than sexual sin. Let me give you an example of that. In Matthew 5, we have Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Turn back over to Matthew 5 if you want to. And I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here, but hey, why not? And he talks about committing adultery. And, of course, obviously that's not a good thing. But a little bit earlier in Matthew 5, now where can I find that? Huh? No, I already, that's where I was talking about. No, it talks about, you have heard that it was said you shall not commit adultery. Okay? Okay, 27, thank you. You have heard that it was said you shall not commit adultery, but I tell you that anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Now this is Jesus is saying, and here he's saying committing adultery is something other than sexual sin. It's the lusting, wanting to commit sexual sin, which is a different thing. Right? So it's not just committing sexual sin, but it is committing sexual sin. Okay? But it can be the lusting. And because I brought that up, I might as well, I can see right now I'm not going to get done with this at the end of today. I'm very sorry. More to myself than anybody else. I was talking to a young fellow one time, back when I was a teenager, and he said, I commit adultery 10 times a day. Talking about this verse right here. And I think it's very possible he was. Now, when you say commit adultery like that, lust after, it's not just, I like her, she's pretty. That's not what he's talking about there. I heard it said one time is, if I could, I would. In other words, the only reason why I'm not is because I can't. And the fellow who said that to me, committing adultery maybe 10 times a day, he was pretty much saying that he would if he could. But it's still not sexual sin. It's lust. And Jesus says that is a sin. That is committing adultery also. Okay, let's get back. I'd like to read to you the 4 times that Jesus talks about this. 2 of them are in Matthew, one's in Mark, one's in Luke. Now, I'm not going to read the whole context because, again, it'd take more time, we'd get sidetracked. Matthew 19, verses 7 through 9. Jesus said, well, why then, they asked, did Moses command that a woman give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. Same thing Mark says. But it was not this way from the beginning. I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another woman commits adultery. Okay? Now, this is again not a big deal, but think about this for a second. There's an exception said here, except for sexual immorality. If his wife is guilty of sexual immorality, that means his wife is an adulterer, right? That's the definition of adultery, sexual sin of a married person. Adultery assumes married person. You do know that. The other is fornication. Okay. So he's saying here, if a man divorces his wife except for sexual immorality and marries another, then the man commits adultery. So they have the woman commit adultery, and he divorces her for that. And then he apparently can get married again without committing adultery. Mark 10, verses 11 and 12. I already read this for you. He answered, if anyone divorces his wife and marries another woman, commits adultery against her. These two words, against her, are not found in the other Gospels. And if she divorces her husband and marries another man, she commits adultery. So it talks about the woman divorcing also, which is something we don't ever hear about in the Old Testament. But apparently at the time of Jesus, a woman could divorce her husband, because Jesus talks about that as a possibility. But my main point here is about those words, against her. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her, meaning against his first wife, who he's already divorced from. How can that be? They're not married anymore. That one's a little more difficult to think about. He's not married to her, but he still does her wrong. Any idea? I'm sorry? Yeah, or for no reason. Yeah, can be. No, the third one is Luke 16:18. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery, and the man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. There's nothing new here except the thing about saying a man who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. That's the first time that's said. And I left Matthew 5:32 for the last, because it's written quite differently. And I think we'll read it. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife except for sexual immorality, same exception, makes her the victim of adultery, and anyone who marries a divorced woman commits adultery. This is from the NIV. That's the Pew Bible here. Now, because I have a problem with that wording, I also put down here the same verse, Matthew 5:32, out of my translation that I love, the New American Standard. Matthew 5:32 in the New American Standard. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, which is the same thing as sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Now, both of these translations, the NIV, has the words makes her in it. The NIV says makes her the victim of adultery, and the New American Standard says makes her commit adultery. Now, that to me is very strange language. Both of them have makes her. But I'm not saying that the victim of adultery is wrong, except I looked up the Greek on this one. I spent some time on this one. And I say that the New American Standard is the better translation, because in the text it has a word that says makes. another word that says her, and then commit adultery is one word. Okay? The words are there. Makes her commit adultery. Whereas the NIV saying the victim of adultery, there's nothing in the text that says or implies victim. So I don't really care for that translation, but I understand why, I think, the NIV said it. Because in Matthew 5:32, when it says makes her, this is what's called passive. You guys in grammar, you remember studying about active and passive? Active is I hit you. Passive is I was hit by you. Active is what I do. Passive is what is done to me. This verb here, makes her, is passive in the Greek. And that's why it says it makes her the victim of adultery, or makes her commit adultery. Now think about that for a minute. Let's read that again. I say to you, this is the New American Standard, that everyone who divorces his wife except for the cause of unchastity makes her commit adultery. What does that mean? You want to take a shot at that?
Well, I was just thinking, the way that's worded like that, it makes it imply that you're not only responsible for the sin you committed, but now you're responsible for the sin that the other person committed too.
Yeah, which is not normally the way we think of sin. I'm responsible for my sins, you're responsible for your sins. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except for the cause of unchastity, makes her commit adultery. Where is the sexual sin in Matthew 5:32? Where is she committing a sexual sin? Here's another time that adultery can't mean sexual sin, because there is no sexual sin on the part of the woman. Does that click with you guys? Are you following me here? It can't mean sexual sin here, because there's no sexual sin. The man hasn't committed a sexual sin. The woman hasn't committed a sexual sin. I wonder if there is a possibility. We have 10 more minutes. I wonder if there's a possibility that it has something to do with verse 9 that we read. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. Is that a quotation from the Old Testament? I don't think so. I couldn't find it anywhere. If somebody can find it anywhere else in the Bible, that's fine. But this seems to be Jesus' own comment. What God has joined together, let no one separate. Is it possible that the separating that he says don't do is a sin? Is it possible that that separating can be called adultery when there's no sexual sin there? Now, let that one roll around in your brain for a little bit. Nathan?
I just want to add to that. I think it does. I think you're right. And, here's why. When I was teaching the math class, we spent like 4 or 5 weeks on Matthew 19:9. I did that, number one, so that you wouldn't have to spend 2 classes on this, you're welcome. And then we looked into the word porneia in Greek that Jesus is using. And if you trace it back to the Old Testament, it's not always sexual. The word itself can mean complaining, murmuring, general unfaithfulness. It's something done that is what we would consider to be like a breaking of marriage vows. So I think you're right. It's not always sexual. If that's what you're getting at.
Well, that's a different thing than saying adultery. Porneia is not translated adultery, But, yeah, breaking of the vows. And that's what Jesus is talking about in verse 9. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate. If you're deliberately separating from your spouse, he's saying that's not good. That's not what God wants. The separation itself. And I think maybe that's some of the answers, some of the things we're talking about here. Okay, I got a few more comments, and I'll see if, oh, Lord help me. I have a serious problem with some folks who want to read verses like these, and they say to me contrary of what the text actually says. We have some people in Churches of Christ as well as other religious groups that will take verses like this, verse 11, for example. Anyone who divorces his wife and marries another woman commits adultery against her. And they'll say, yeah, that just says he divorces his wife, but he doesn't really divorce his wife. That says that he marries another, but he really isn't married to another. Have you ever heard people say that? I have numerous times. And I have a serious problem with saying that it doesn't mean what the text says. I believe that when he said divorces his wife, he means there really is a divorce. And when he says he marries another, there really is another marriage. But we have folks that want to say that there's not really a divorce, there's not really another marriage. I have a real problem with that. There is something else that I think has to be considered in this that's not really specifically about divorce, but it comes up in any discussions about it, and that is, how very important was it in the Old Testament and in the New Testament for a person to be a virgin at the time of marriage, for not having had sex at the time of marriage? Specifically in the Old Testament, do you know how many times it says that a woman needs to be a virgin at the time of marriage? More than you can count. And there's all kinds of events that happen in the Old Testament where this becomes a big factor. And what would it say if a woman lied about being a virgin at the time of marriage, and then later on her husband finds out? Do you know what it says? It says that she gets killed for it, for lying about her virginity. It was very, very important. In the Old Testament, an unmarried woman, a young unmarried woman, was considered to be a virgin. And sometimes the words were used that way. But the word just meant unmarried woman. Okay? She was supposed to be having no sex before marriage, which again, since the 1960s, has been something that a lot of people hear and they go, what? Never thought of that. Never thought of having that kind of thing. That says to me a couple of thoughts. If the Jews in the Old Testament thought it was so seriously important for a woman to be a virgin at marriage, does not that imply that the men should also be? Do we hear much about that in the Old Testament? Oh, I don't think so one time. So yes, that's one reason why a lot of women today want to talk about the patriarchy that run the whole world, that kind of thing. But any serious Jew that would be thinking about this in the Old Testament would realize that if the woman was supposed to be a virgin at marriage, then the man was supposed to be a virgin at marriage too.
There's a lot of stories about harlots in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but that doesn't make that right either.
I'm saying, the rules were different for a lot of people.
Yeah. Okay, any comments? Is it possible that we can leave this right here? Or am I going to come in next Sunday and somebody's going to immediately raise their hand and say, I got to ask you 15 questions about last week?